The character Blade first appeared in Marvel Comics' The Tomb of Dracula number 10 in 1973. He was a supporting character whose appearance was based on various black actors of the time like Richard Roundtree and Jim Brown. As his popularity grew, he got his own solo story in Vampire Tales number 8 in 1974. In the years that followed, he appeared in Ghost Rider, Morbius, Night Stalkers, and finally in 1994 he had his own series, Blade the Vampire Hunter. Since the early 90s, New Line Cinema had been doing very well adapting lesser-known comic series to film. They were approached by director Ernest Dickerson, who wanted to make a film based on the character Blade. David Goyer, who'd been a longtime fan of the character, wrote the first draft of the script. New Line met with Marvel, who'd already spoken to Dickerson, and they wanted LL Cool J to play the lead. Dickerson left the project to work on something else, and New Line brought in Steve Norrington as a replacement. Norrington had a background in special effects and just finished working on the ambitious sci-fi action film Death Machine. Wesley Snipes was working on a film adaptation of Black Panther at Columbia and was frustrated the production stalled. He received a copy of the script for Blade and left Black Panther, which ended up never coming together anyway. He liked Blade so much, he not only agreed to star, but also became a producer. Now with Snipes on board, Goyer returned to refine the script. He worked with Norrington to update the Blade story to current times and keep the darker tone of the comics. While the script kept some things from the comics, they worked on a new vampire mythology. For example, they got rid of things like crosses and holy water being used as weapons. They said, what if the vampire was Jewish? Why would a cross work on him? They wanted to give it just a little more foundation in reality for something so outlandish. Since Norrington had a background in visual effects, he worked closely with the production design team to make sure they got the right look for the film. He didn't want the gothic romantic style vampires of Anne Rice, he was looking for a meaner, sort of modern vampire. Snipes had been training in martial arts since he was 12 years old. He was a 5th degree black belt in karate and was fluid in many different styles. He loved Hong Kong action movies, and since Blade would have numerous fight scenes, he wanted them to be more like that than typical Hollywood action. Snipes brought in his longtime friend Jeff Ward to do the fight choreography. They met on Streets of Gold in 1986 and worked together many times since. Ward's done an insane amount of stunt work, one of my personal favorites being his work on The Last Dragon. With the production further along, they began casting. Stephen Dorff was hired to play the villainous Deacon Frost. He read the script and liked it, but the character was written to be much older and somewhat cliché. He worked with Norrington and Goyer to make Frost a younger, incredibly arrogant villain. In a meeting discussing the character of Frost, Snipes stated he was the kind of guy who would ice skate uphill. Goyer and Norrington loved it and insisted on putting it into the movie.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
Norrington was a fan of The Prisoner, so he wanted Patrick McGoohan for the part of Whistler. When that didn't work out, they decided to go with Chris Christopherson. They designed his character as the grungy grandfather, the modern-day Van Helsing that could still easily kick ass if he had to. They hired N. Bush Wright to play the leading lady Karen, Donnell Logue as Frost's sidekick Quinn, and Udo Kier as Dragon Eddie. This was the third time Kier played a vampire. He was even Dracula in Blood for Dracula in 1974. Logue originally had a much smaller part, but was so funny on set they expanded his character and let him ad-lib a good portion of his dialogue. Spanish model Arlie Jover played Mercury. She had very little acting experience, but Norrington loved her look and thought she'd be perfect as one of the lead vampires. Late in pre-production, the producers suggested bringing in Tracy Lords to play the small role of Raquel. She had the right amount of arrogance and sex appeal to make this very minor character memorable. Goyer was having trouble with the third act of the film. He felt the first two were solid, but wasn't completely sold on the ending. He wrote a dozen different endings and finally narrowed it down to the one he thought would work best. After a long pre-production, they started filming. The movie was shot mostly in and around downtown LA. The hospital scenes were shot in an abandoned hospital in Long Beach. In the scene where Quinn fights with Karen, he fell and immediately started screaming. Because of the way he fell, he massively dislocated his jaw. They rushed him to a real hospital where they thought he was there for severe burns since he still had the prosthetic melted skin from the shoot. After relocating his jaw, Logue explained he broke his jaw in a motorcycle accident years ago, and if it gets hit the wrong way, it unhinges and locks in place. Goyer and Norrington fought the studio over a very unusual scene. Towards the beginning, where Karen's talking to an ex-boyfriend at the hospital, the scene intentionally drags on. They called it the Melrose Place segment. They purposely wanted to inject this dull romantic drama to lull the audience into a false sense of security. Then, when Quinn leaps up to kill the guy, it's a surprise. The executives tried to get them to cut the scene, but they argued to leave it in, and when they showed it to test audiences, it got one of the biggest reactions. The design team worked with Norrington on the character of Pearl, the vampire keeper of the scrolls. Originally designed as an androgynous Japanese man, Norrington pushed to have it this morbidly obese vampire. The original design had Pearl sitting in his own filth, surrounded by dozens of dead children that other vampires had brought him to feed on. The studio thought that was in incredibly poor taste, so they removed any notion of dead kids. They had to build the set around the monster. It was something like 700 pounds of latex skin that had to be moved with a forklift. It was controlled by 5 actors. 4 puppeteers worked the arms and legs, and 1 was the head. They had hoses that pumped fresh cold air into the body. While the monster was essentially a giant animatronic puppet, they still added some CG to enhance the skin. There was another part the studio had issue with. When Karen first arrives at Blade's lair, she finds a jar with a vampire baby Whistler had been using for weapons testing. That part was cut because the studio said it was too horrible. It was Snipes' idea to have the entrance to Pearl's lair be through a walk-in freezer. He also suggested the young martial arts kid, Ebony Adams. He wanted a completely unexpected moment in the film where this girl seems helpless and then proceeds to kick Blade's ass. Adams was a young martial arts prodigy who was trained under Billy Blanks and took time off from her competition schedule to be in the movie. For the subway scene, the train car was all CG. They bought 3 subway cars and used the interiors of them for certain shots, but the exteriors were CG. To add some humor and a lot of insanity to the film, they added the sequence where Blade goes to a vampire club filled with Japanese businessmen watching the pop-punk band Shonen Knife. That's director Stephen Norrington in a cameo as one of the vampires. Director David Fincher did one of the rewrites of the script. He told Goyer in the film Blade needed to kill his mother, his father, and Buddha. So in the film, he kills his mother, he kills Frost, who technically was his father since he turned his mother into a vampire, and Buddha was Whistler, his mentor. In an earlier draft, he kills Whistler, but in the final version, his fate was uncertain. In one version of the ending, it's Whistler who's the vampire getting ready to kill the girl in Moscow. They shot a few different endings for the film. The first one was partially conceived. Frost becomes La Magra and unleashes the blood tide, which washes over the city and turns everyone it touches into a vampire. They ended it with the vampires winning and causing the vampire apocalypse. They set it up so in a proposed sequel, Blade and Karen would travel around, sorta like Mad Max, raiding and destroying vampire food storage areas. Since they weren't sure if there would be a sequel, they went with the original proposed ending of Frost turning into the Blood God and Blade fighting him. They screened the film for test audiences who loved the movie all the way up to the final fight. They hated that Frost was the villain, and then in the end, Blade was fighting against a giant CG blood tornado. They went back and reshot some scenes, adding Frost coming in and out of the blood, taunting Blade. This tested even worse. They realized the problem was the audience wanted to see Blade fighting Frost, not a visual effect. They asked the studio for more money and worked on an extended fight sequence between Blade and Frost. Goyer remembered from the screenings the scene where the vampires exploded from the EDTA anticoagulants got a huge reaction every time. He worked that into the ending, so now when Blade fights Frost, it ends with him exploding. Months later, they screened this version and the audience loved it. So it shows that test audiences aren't always a bad thing. The movie was in production for over 2 years and finally released on October 21st, 1998. It was a huge success, spending 2 weeks at the #1 spot and pulling in $131 million versus its $40 million budget. An X-Men movie was already in the works at Fox, but with the success of Blade, it reinvigorated the production and made the studio take it more seriously. X-Men was released on July 14, 2000 and made almost $300 million. This overwhelming success kickstarted the next wave of superhero films, which is going stronger than ever today. The importance of Blade can't be understated. It was a serious comic book movie that was released in a time when comic book movies weren't being taken seriously. Blade started a franchise that was even more successful with Blade 2, and the series came to a crashing halt with Blade Trinity. There was even a short-lived TV series with Kirk Sticky Fingers Jones in the lead role. In 2015 at the San Diego Comic-Con, Snipes was in talks with Marvel about making at least one more movie. Blade is outstanding. It's got the right mix of action, humor, and a great deal of world building. Norrington said the movie was an ode to Sam Peckinpah, and at its core, it was a western. It crammed a lot of story into 2 hours without it feeling overloaded. Snipes nailed the character, and while I'm sure eventually Marvel Disney will reboot the series, it's going to be tough to find somebody who can match his performance. The only downside to the movie now is some of the CG is dated. It doesn't detract from the movie overall, it's just some of the scenes stand out, in a bad way. Still, at least they made the smart choice to change the ending. If they didn't, it's possible that people would have laughed at Dorf's blood tornado, the series would have never made it past part 1, and we potentially would not have the massive comic book universes we have in cinema today.
Are you out of your damn mind?